Oh, hi. I'm Josh from Bernal Cutlery, and we're going to look at some American knives today. Come on, let's go. All right, so here's a few American-made knives that I've either been waiting for special occasion to clean them up, or they've been part of my personal collection, and I am now tearfully going to part with them. It's hard to avoid the J. Russell Green River Company if we're talking about American-made knives. They weren't the first firm to mass-produce knives in the United States. That probably goes to the Harrington Cutlery Company, otherwise now known as Dexter. But J. Russell really was the one that got a large number of knives being made to supply outside of his local Massachusetts market. And it didn't take long for J. Russell to become a really super important American knife maker and catch the attention of the British and kind of start a little bit of a trade war with Sheffield dumping inexpensive knives into the United States before the Civil War to try and catch the American makers that were starting to take hold off balance. One thing with American knife making is that right away American knife makers were very comfortable with integrating machinery into their production. They were kind of reinventing the wheel in a way. There were people from Sheffield that had moved to New England and were working with knife makers there, as well as immigrants from Germany and other knife making regions of Europe. But the Sheffield connection, that was the largest influence in New England. Didn't take long for knife making to start up in San Francisco right after the gold rush. Items were hard to import into San Francisco. This is long before the Transcontinental Railroad, so goods had to travel all around the tip of South America and back up to reach San Francisco. So things were expensive, things didn't show up, maybe things got rusty along the way. So there was a big move to make things locally in San Francisco. There was a lot of pride taken in the skill of the local craftsmen, which would have been called mechanics back in the day. Will and Finck was the kind of largest knife making enterprise, but there were quite a number of shops in San Francisco, and San Francisco had a pretty high density of knife makers. There was culinary knives being made, barware, and a lot of Bowie knives and fighting knives. This was a relatively lawless period of time in San Francisco. People had a lot of money that were involved with the gold and silver that were being mined. The Comstock lode really pumped a lot of cash into San Francisco. A lot of people in town were becoming very prosperous, and having fine cutlery was definitely an important thing in the 19th century. Will and Finck made some really beautiful, distinctive California-style work. There were a number of other makers in San Francisco that were doing this style, so they didn't invent it per se, but they might be the one that you would tend to find. Michael Price was their main rival. He was an Irish immigrant, and he produced some very fine cutlery as well. A lot of it is found with walrus tusk. This is local staghorn from California. These are probably from the 1860s to 1890s. I think it's probably from the latter period. I don't know 100% for sure, but being that they have these relatively unadorned nickel ferrules, leads me to believe that this might have been from the later period when they were starting to look at creating some more affordable items. But these still weren't cheap back in the day. These would have been about the equivalent of $200. This would have sold for $12 back in the 1890s from catalogs that exist. So not cheap, and they weren't cheaply made either. So these were very finely made. You don't tend to find a lot of old chef's knives in with American knives. They don't tend to start popping up until the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. People weren't using chef's knives outside of professional restaurants in large cities, and so home cooking, a lot of it was done with carving knives. Utility knives were also very much a part of daily life. The bullnose definitely was a knife that featured very large in American knife making. Of course, it's a great knife for butchery, but it also was a knife that was used quite a bit in home cooking environments as well. Landers, Frary, and Clark became the largest American knife making concern out of Connecticut, and this is a double shear steel knife, kind of an unusual find. Double shear steel is made by taking very pure wrought iron bars and placing them in a ceramic kind of cask in a big box that's sealed up with charcoal inside, and those are heated up for days on end and then cooled slowly. These are done in large conical brick structures, and in the process of heating and slowly cooling the iron bars and the charcoal, carbon from the charcoal migrates into the iron, creating steel. And the test for whether it had formed steel would be to bang on one of those bars, and if it sheared instead of bent, that is, if it broke instead of bent, then you had steel. And double shear steel is doing that twice. So you take your bars, you turn them into shear steel, rework them, and then do the process again. And so you get a very high carbon content steel. Village Blacksmith is another interesting knife making concern out of Wisconsin, from Washington Cutlery Company in the late 19th century into 1940. You know, they made some stuff fairly similar to other knife makers, and then there was some kind of unusual patterns that they were doing, and a lot of it seemingly influenced from German patterns, and there definitely was a lot of German immigration into that part of the United States. This smaller one would have been a bit wider originally, but this is from a 19th century German slicing pattern, and this is a knife that would have been used for people at home as a multi-purpose knife. This other one is the only one I've ever found of its footprint, and it's kind of unusual. It really looks like a knife for chopping up carne asada to me. It very much looks like some knives I've seen being made in Mexico, and possibly there's some Mexican connection to Wisconsin in around 1920, but I kind of doubt it. So this one's a little bit of a mystery, but it pretty clearly is a knife for chopping up cooked meat, possibly raw meat. But anyhow, this is a fun one. You know, sometimes it's real easy to know what a knife was intended for and what its story is, and then other times things pop up that, you know, don't have the answers for, and it's kind of fun to see how they end up getting used by people and to hear back from cooks that put them to use. So that's going to be a fun one for someone. This unusual shaped knife in the center here is from the J. Russell Green River Company, and this was a knife meant for amputees after the Civil War. There were plenty of men that lost arms in the war, and this knife solved the problem of holding a fork and a knife with two hands, so it is a fork and a knife. The curved edge allows you to roll the knife along a plate and cut your food, and then have a fork right in the same hand. And these have always been, to me, a little bit of a sad reminder of the cost of that war. But a really interesting knife, and they were made over a long period of time, and this is one of the first iterations of it with that hot stamp mark. They stopped making a hot stamp in the 1880s, so this predates 1880. This really long knife marked Gustav Naus from New York was most likely made by one of the big New England knife makers. Russell made this pattern. Lamson and Goodnow did as well. There were several other knife makers that did, and it definitely shows the English influence in American knife making. This long parallel-sided blade with the bullnose tip and the handle that has the short bird's head pommel are very English. And if it didn't have the American markings on it, and I hadn't seen other knives that look exactly like this with the American markings, I would think that this was English. But it's American, and these were made for carving giant roast beefs. That one's 14 inches and super flexible and light. They typically come in a little bit smaller than this one, but this one's really nice. This has that ideal style pattern, forged integral bolster, and I strongly suspect that this was made after 1920 when the ideal pattern was developed in Thiers, and that integral bolster started to be forged in with a lot of different knives, starting with the French knives. So this has an English and a French influence in it as well. Older versions of these roast beef slicers will have what sometimes people call a Nogent style handle with the second ferrule ring and the one-piece wood handle. So this might not be quite as old as it looks. I think it's most likely from the 1920s, but it has a very strong 19th century feel. But it's a great example of how a lot of stuff that was being done in the 20s really does look like 19th century work, in that a lot of old techniques and machinery were used then. So that can be kind of an interesting period of time as a transition from the 19th century to 20th century. Well, thank you for joining us as we took a look at just a couple of these old American knives and a little bit of old American knife making history. It's a big topic, so just only scratch the surface here a tiny bit, I feel. And I certainly feel like I have a lot more to learn the more that I get into this. But definitely curious to hear if there's anything that you all are curious about, what you'd like to get more information on. If there's something that you found that you want to know more about, hit us up. I'm definitely love seeing what people are finding out there. Thanks again for watching.